So just a little bit about Chino. So Chino is actually a research assistant at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. So he has a degree in molecular biology and biotechnology from the University of the Philippines. And currently he's working on the effects of steroids in the brain, especially on cell function and organism behavior. So since last week, sorry, 2 weeks ago, we had the first lecture series on research topic proposal, and for now we will have another lecture on literature search and review, which is actually very needed once you're going to draft your research proposal and when you're writing your manuscript. So to give us this lecture is Chino. So Chino, I'm turning the screen to you.
Alright. Hi guys, good evening and good morning sa mga nasa other side of the world. So, hi, I'm Chino. I'm Jose Sandino Bandonil, but I'm Chino. And today we'll be talking about literature search and review. Now, I know that a lot of your research teachers might have already taught you some theoretical aspect on how to do this, like literature, this task, very important task in our research. So today, what we're gonna be focusing on are the practicalities, like how do I do this? How do I do this easily? So, ayun. So, last time, Sir Jonas gave us, in selecting a research topic, he gave us these 6 questions, six major questions on how to select your research topic and how to make it more narrow. But we don't really know how to answer these questions, and so today it's gonna be all about that. How do we answer these questions? And the answer is, to that previous question, is through literature. So what is this thing called literature? We know literature as English literature in a more of an arts and humanities way, but really literature is all about the work that are published on particular subject or field. So these can be books, so the textbooks that we use. These can be journal articles that are published in specific scientific journals. These can be review papers that are also in those same journals, monographs, a lot of things. There are also technical papers that are published by companies. So how do we there are a lot of literature, and some of them might be fake news. Some of, like, for example, there was one time I saw something like how COVID-19 actually came from meteorites or something like that. And of course, we know that that's not true, but it's literature. So what do we look at when we when we select our literature? So the most important part of it is that it's authoritative. And there are 3 major things that can qualify a source as authoritative. So first is it's based on prior knowledge. So like if you know the quote of Isaac Newton where he said that he was standing on the shoulders of giants, and it's precisely that. They're building on previous knowledge essentially. Number 2, subject to peer review. So the current scientific establishment is utilizes peer review peer review meaning these papers are scrutinized by other experts in the field, and they decide on the veracity of these papers. And finally, logically sound. And this is something that you would have to figure out by yourself by looking at the literature, like if it makes sense for you. Okay. Now, another thing about literature, and possibly unintended, but it's there, is that it's hierarchical. So some literature might be more authoritative than others, and some of these things that we look at to determine kung how much it is, how how more authoritative it is are first is the distance from observer. So we all know about this primary source and secondary source. Now, so we know that primary source is more important because they saw the event firsthand. They did the experiments firsthand. The secondary sources, they just collate all of these different papers and interpret and put their own interpretation on them. So it's more of there's bias, essentially. And second, recentness. So we tend to view more recently published things as more authoritative simply because these things might have debunked the previous publications. So in light of that, there's this, when looking at your literature, you have your hierarchy of journal articles. It's greater than review papers, it's greater than books. Why? Because journal articles are, they're the hot of the press research, essentially. So, for example, these experiments, these data were done like maybe 2 years from now at the very, at most, or like 2 weeks or a month from, 2 weeks from public, so 6 months from publication pala, I'm sorry. Or at, it can be as short as like a month or 2 weeks from publication. So, very, like sa case ng COVID papers recently. So these are very, very recent papers. Then next are review papers. So these review papers essentially collate all of these different journal articles and they try to summarize everything and maybe interpret these papers in their entirety. But the nature of the nature of this method of writing, meaning they collect many papers over a period of time, means that it's less fresh then. And finally, the books, because these books can tend to have information that are like 5 years old. So it might not be as updated as we would like it to be. So next is, why do we do this? So reading literature, the skill of reading literature is actually the heart of the scientific endeavor, because it's where you base everything from your background to your experiments. And so there are three different things. Of course, there are probably other things, but there are three general things that we're looking for when we read literature. So first, when you don't know anything about the field, so first you're trying to understand the field or the field your subject. So for example, my mentees, they're trying to understand molecular docking. They don't know anything about it. So they would look at these established knowledge. So what is molecular docking? What is it good for? So, and then they're trying to understand the specific methods, the specific methods from these papers. So of course so the best sources for this specific goal are the books, the review papers, and technical papers that are sent out by companies. So now next is we look for the gaps in the field and we formulate hypotheses. So this is the point where we're trying to select the research topic. So some of these gaps in the field are unanswered details. So for example, this protein binds this specific chemical, and they were able to prove it on a cellular basis. But how does it exactly go when you look at the molecular level? So these are some of the details that we're looking at or that we don't know. Or how do we improve the methods that are currently being used? So for example, before, when we were trying to do gene editing before CRISPR, it's a very tedious task. But now that we have CRISPR, so the method was improved and the time for gene editing became so much easier. The time became so much shorter, I'm sorry. And now the best sources for these, looking at these gaps, are the journal articles and again, your technical papers. And finally, so you've already formulated your hypothesis and now you're doing your experiments. So these papers are very useful first in designing your experiment. So you want your experimental design to be very good because you only have a specific amount of money, you only have a specific amount of reagents to do your experiments with, and you want to be able to do. You also you only have specific amount of time to do your experiments, and you want to be able to get it in the first shot. And so these papers give you give you the controls that are appropriate for experiment, or give you the protocols that would help you reach, prove or disprove your hypothesis. And then sometimes, not really sometimes, most of the time when you do your experiments, they might fail because it's natural. Sometimes you just don't don't have you just don't have the protocols. You just have to do it again and again to be better at doing these things. It's a skill. Experimentation is a skill, and so you want to look for where you went wrong. This optimization lets you look for lets you optimize your experiments. This literature lets you optimize your experiments. So again, we have your best sources. You can look at your journal articles at their methodology page, methodology part, and you can even look at the websites of your suppliers. So for example, you have this specific reagent that doesn't work. Maybe you were not storing it appropriately, for example. So essentially, like I said, in summary, TLDR, literature is the foundation of your project. So now that we know why we're doing this, how are we supposed to read our literature? How are we supposed to look for literature? So first off, the first step, very important, is you need to formulate your question. You have to know what exactly you're looking for, because it's very easy to click on things that are interesting to you and stray from your goal. And in the end, you spend too much time reading about things that might not be so related to your to what you're really looking for. And ayun nga, it prevents you from taking too much time because you have to do other things, right? So you have to know what you're looking for. Now, when you know what you're looking for, of course, you look for the literature. So we want to choose relevant papers. And how do we do that? In a very quick way. So you check the title and you check the abstract. So, right, the abstract. So it's a summary of the key points of the paper. So, like I said here in the slide, Google is your friend. So you can just search the keywords in Google, or you can also search these databases. So Google, PubMed, Google Scholar, PubMed, Science Direct, ProQuest, PubChem. There are others more. There are also other databases that are tailored to other specific fields. Yeah, so you can see the links here naman. So when you check this later, you can check the video recording later. You can look at this specific part, and then sometimes we go encounter paywalls, and we have to pay for a lot of money to be able to read these papers. But there are other websites that give you free but illegal copies of papers and books. So you have LibGen and SciHub. So you may notice that there are no links there. You might just have to search it for yourself. Remember, they are illegal. Now, when you have your literature, you need to read the literature, of course. We don't want to end up clicking links and then having several tabs on your browser that you never open until the end of time. So we need to organize, we need to be able to read them. So of course, there are a lot of papers to read. It's very, very overwhelming. So what at least I do is I classify them um, into two. So I have my critical literature and I have my non-critical literature. So critical literature essentially, you have to know everything from that literature. So how they did it, how they what are essentially what are the specific results, what are the details of these results, how did they get these results, and these papers or articles tend to be the ones that are the first to provide evidence of some phenomenon. So for example, the ones that proved um, the existence of DNA as the genetic molecule. So Watson and Crick, for example, and obviously Franklin. And then, or you can also look at other papers that rebut these other literature. So it's also critical because sometimes, of course, a lot of times, theories are there are several competing theories for a specific phenomenon, and they are trying to prove that they are the theory that interprets whatever is happening. Next, we go to non-critical literature. So this is essentially just to provide additional context or to confirm previous evidence. So, for example, if you're rooting for this specific theory and it's part of your project, so you want to put these papers in your literature to further prove that your point is authoritative. It's true. But at this point, so it's very overwhelming to read these papers. I know. As a high school student, it's we don't essentially I don't essentially I was overwhelmed by these journal articles. I didn't know how to read them, how to understand them. We know how to understand books at that point because we've been reading books for several years, but papers are a very, very new thing. So I'm gonna give a short structure on how to read paper. So first, let's go to the basics of what a scientific paper offers. So you have first. So let's use this specific paper in Cell by Daikan et al. From Lihui Tsai's lab. They're working on neuroscience in MIT. So first, let's look at. So first thing we look at, of course, as I said before, is the title and the abstract. So they summarize the content of the paper, and they usually contain the methods and the results. At least the good papers, the well-written papers, contain the methods and the results. So that lets you decide how critical the paper is, and so that lets you decide if it's critical or non-critical, and how urgent it is to your project. Next, there's an introduction. So this introduction essentially provides an overview of the field. So what's the current knowledge, essentially? This is what they use to set up the logic and the motivations for their paper, for their experiments. So think of a paper as a story, and this is the build-up. The introduction is the build-up. And so, or the introduction of the characters, maybe. But of course, when you've read too much about the paper, so I think for some of you, maybe, I don't know if some of you have reached that point, but at some point you just, when you've been reading so many papers, the introductions tend to contain the same thing. And so you can skip them if you already understand, you've already read a lot of the papers. So next, the results. So the heart of the paper. So it's the gist of the paper, and it's the most important part that you need to understand. So the results, usually you can divide them into two parts. You have your figures and you have your text. So the most important part are the figures because it contains the data, and so it lets you, when you look at, it's essentially you can't hide data from your readers, right? And so when you look at the figures, you can interpret the data for yourself. And then of course, you don't always understand the figures. That's when you go to the text. So the text, sometimes the figures are jumbled together. Sometimes you don't know the logical flow. Like why did research proposal? It provides the future directions and your gaps in the field. So these are points of improvement that you can fill in. Finally, you have your experimental methods. So essentially, the protocols that you use, the very specific things like how, at what temperature did they heat this compound, how long did they heat this compound, did they spin it down. So um, they, so you can follow the specific protocols to help you plan your experiments, to design your experiments, and then they can also point you to the good good chemicals, the good reagents, or the good supplies, like the ones that work for them. Because usually the ones that work for a lot of papers are the ones that would work for you as well. Because some of these other reagents, they don't really work. And then finally, they are very important. As I said before, it's very important. They're very important to when you're troubleshooting your experiments. So when you're trying to fix your experimental design. So now that we know the parts of the paper, how do we read them? So this structure that I'm showing you is something that I've learned for myself, and I've also asked other friends that I have in the scientific community how they read papers, and a lot of them do this specific structure. So first, you read the abstract, of course. So then, do I understand the field? Have I read too many papers about the field? And if yes, you can go straight to figures. But if no, you go to the introduction, you try to understand the logic behind their paper. Then you go to the figures. Inevitably, when you look at the figures, everyone will have questions about the data. And you will, so usually these questions about usually logical flow or controls, usually you would be able to resolve them when you read the text of the paper. So you can see, for example, figure 2C. So you don't get figure 2C, you look for the part of the text where they mention figure 2C, essentially. Then when you're done with the figures, you go to the summary and try to understand how it fits into what's known in the field, and usually in the end. So all throughout this process, you would end up asking, ideally, you would end up having questions about a lot of things. And so usually, so you should try to answer these questions by, you can return to the paper. Maybe they would, when you read the paper again, and they would have some part that would clarify your question. But some papers kind of assume that you already know about the answer to your question, because they assume that you're already an expert in the field. So you go look at other sources so not necessarily other journal articles, but maybe you can go look at review articles or books, or again, the reagent supplier websites, to answer your question. So essentially, until you have questions, you don't finish reading the paper until most, if not all, of your questions are answered. Now, at that point, when you think you've already exhausted the paper, then all the knowledge you can get from the paper, you should summarize the content for yourself. It ensures that you really do understand the paper, and it helps you in the next part of our talk, which is all about literature review. So, okay, let's go back to reading papers first, though. So, things to keep in mind while you're reading the papers. These are the important questions. So, what are the assumptions that the authors of the paper make. So for each of these experiments, they have specific assumptions on the condition that they're trying to prove, or the at least the phenomenon that they're trying to prove or disprove. And then how was each experiment conducted? You can look at the methodology for that. And the more important question though is this specific experiment appropriate for the point that they're trying to make? So yeah, some of these experiments have limitations, and so you should ensure that the point they're trying to make don't bump up against these limitations. And do the author's conclusions match their data? Like I said, the figures might not be this. Sometimes authors may overinterpret their data. And finally, no, not finally, sorry, is the logic of their paper sound? So does it make sense essentially? And finally, how can I improve this paper? Again, important for for selecting a research topic. Okay, so now that you've read the paper, you need to organize the different papers that you've read. So, syempre, that you have a lot of papers, 10 number and tens of papers. So they would all be a jumble in your head, and essentially it wouldn't make sense for you if you don't organize them. There are a lot of ways to organize your papers. One of the more popular ones is is through the topics that they cover. So what specific field are they covering, for example, or what specific subfield, for example. And then when you read each of the papers, in the end, like I said, summarize. So you write down the key points and your questions, the lingering questions, for the gaps in the field that you realize after every paper. And now when you can use these points, key points and questions to think of the next next question that you would look for when you again do the literature search, and when you do your research proposal. So pro tip: keep everything in one place, or at least two places. Two places works for me, at least. So you have your reference managers and your Word or Excel to do this. So for example, these are some reference managers that are available: Mendeley, Papers 3, and EndNote. So EndNote is not free, so don't use that unless you have institutional access. Mendeley I recommend because it's free. The full program is free. Papers 3, they only have a trial period, and some of the free trial period and some of the only some of the features are available. So Mendeley all the way. Or you can organize it Word. So for example, one time when my boss asked me to write a part in a review paper. So what I did was for example, I classified them, for example, according to compound. Then you have these bullet points that are the key points. Then you have your keywords for each of the paper. And you have the reference. Now that you've organized your literature, the next step naturally is to do the literature review. So what's a literature review? Essentially, it's an exhaustive. When I say exhaustive, it really is an exhaustive summary of all the current knowledge on your project. So for example, if you're working on bacterial on a specific bacterial receptor, or an antibiotic, for example, you're working on vancomycin. So what is the current knowledge on vancomycin? All of it. So all of it. Like what's the current state of the field, essentially. So of course, we can't include everything in there. It's a lot of papers essentially, and you have to narrow down what does exhaustive mean. Like what specific topics do we do an exhaustive summary on? So Usually, it's all about what the background of your project is. So if you're doing on something on this specific antibiotic, all on this specific antibiotic. If you're doing something on this specific um, protein, everything that's known about this specific protein. And also, you can look at the experimental methods that you use. So, for example, if you're using um, the colony, I don't know the term, sorry, the one for testing antibiotics. So, um, what's the uh, what what's the theory behind this specific experiment? So, um, yeah, was essentially a theoretical background for your experimental methods. And the whole point of this is just to answer the questions that your reader might have when you're looking at your data. So inevitably, like I said before, when you look at the figures of some paper, you end up having questions. And ideally, your literature review would be able to answer those questions that your reader might have. That's why you want an exhaustive summary, because some of these readers might be experts in their own in the field, and you would want to be able to answer their questions, even if they're already experts in the field. So how do we do a literature review? There is no single way to do a literature review. So I'm just gonna provide these specific pointers. So first, very important, like I said before, you organize your literature by key points. Right. So why? Because it helps you in synthesizing the knowledge that you gain from your literature. So when you're writing, you would want to be able to draw concepts from the literature very easily, because it's not like it's not ideal when you have to stop to look for specific papers when you're writing. Like it disrupts the flow, like the momentum that you already have when you're writing. Then before you start writing, you need to outline the sections that you're gonna write on. So it provides context, not just for you, but also for the reader. And again, it helps your brain draw from key points in the literature. So, for example, if in this specific paper you're saying that prevent some specific reaction, and when you remember, oh, in this section of your review, it said one of the sections in your review says chemical, and your mind automatically associates that word uh, with literature that you read. And then, of course, keep it flowing. So we all know that these literature reviews can be very boring. Like, a lot of people would agree with me if I say that it's the most boring part of a proposal, or of a of a manuscript. But if you write well, if you keep a good flow, like you don't just abruptly stop from one section to another. You add some transitions between different sections. You can actually make your literature review less boring, or uh, more more enticing, at least. Because remember, your teacher would have to read a lot of literature reviews, because they're teaching a lot of groups. So you want your literature review to stand out. And finally, you have to keep it logical. So this flow of the review that I'm talking about, you can use your logic would actually drive this flow, and it would end up letting the reader understand how you think. So usually literature review is right before the data. So when your readers already understand how you think, it would be easier for them to understand your figures, because they already know how your mind thinks about things. Okay, so yeah. So essentially, yeah, that's how you do a literature review. So actually, that's the end of the talk. So do you have any questions?
Okay, so thank you, Chino, for that uh, lecture, and I think it's really informative, even for us, not just the mentees. So, guys, if you have questions, Chino is really willing to answer your to answer your queries and your questions. So also we have a group chat, so you can send your message there. Anyone? Let's take this opportunity to answer to ask Chino regarding all the literature search and review related questions that we have.
Ask on guys. I don't bite.
Okay, I think one question is as you mentioned, because a lot of students and probably even researchers tend to just look for whatever uh, article would come out when they search uh, a keyword or something like that. And I know
Mm-hmm.
you have provided an an insight on how to reduce this phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
but
Right.
on a personal note, how how could probably for a high school student, syempre ano pa sila eh, parang masyado pang malawak yung kanilang, kumbaga they're interested in a lot of things.
Right.
So how can they narrow it down a little bit more that would suit a high school student?
Right. That's a good question. I actually had the same problem then when I started out doing science.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would suggest is to look at science news. So, for example, you can go to Nature or Science. So, nature.com. They're not just publishing papers, they're also publishing news reports about specific discoveries. So, what do you think? So, what I'm assuming here na when very broad means you don't know the field that you're interested in pa, diba?
Mm-hmm.
And so, um, when you look at parang when you actually you just look at the headlines like, oh, this thing seems interesting to me, and that already provides you a clue like what field am I gonna be interested in. So for example, ako, I actually graduate ako ng college from molecular biology without finding the field that I like. So pero during my short master's tenure, kasi I dropped out of it to work overseas. I found actually interested pala ako sa neuroscience. So, yeah, you just need to actively look at the broader fields and then see what picks your fancy, I guess.
Okay, so
I
so
have questions po.
okay.
Hello po.
Hi.
How many literature or articles should we allot for like a specific topic in our research? For example, we are looking for the effectiveness of this kind of product or plant. Is it enough dalawa or tatlong literature review lang po ilagay to prove na
I'm sorry. Sorry, can you repeat that? The last part, medyo
sorry.
choppy.
How many literature or articles should we allot for like a specific topic in our research? Like for example, if we are looking for the effectiveness of this kind of product or plant, is it enough kung isa or dalawa lang po yung literature na nahanap namin to prove na effective talaga siya?
That's a good question. You mean, clarify ko lang so you mean wala kayong mahanap na iba, so isa or dalawa lang talaga?
Opo, pag mga ganong case po.
Actually, I think that's pretty good. So that's good for selecting your research. Ibig sabihin, ang dami pang gaps sa research nyo. Gaps dun sa field na kino-cover nyo. So I think that's okay. If kung yun lang talaga yung makita nyo, ganun lang talaga. Pero syempre, I think Um, Yun nga lang, that's not the case for a lot of other topics. Although, of course, syempre parang I would imagine that this is a little academics oriented din, 'di ba, yung research natin. So, probably baka hindi maniwala yung teacher niyo na ito lang pala yung papers available. Baka tamad lang kayo. So, I would suggest when you write your literature review, you have to note then in the literature review na there are a lot of gaps in this field and ito lang talaga yung alam right now and that's why we're doing this specific field.
Thank you po.
No problem.
Okay, so from the Facebook.
May tanong po
Okay,
ako.
okay, sure.
How do you know if like nakuha mo na lahat ng information mo that you need from that literature? Like how would you know that it's like you got wala nang tatanungin yung teacher mo sa'yo, ganon?
Excuse me. Honestly, the short answer is you never know, but the long answer is do you think na when you read your background and your figures, do you think na the questions that people would have when they see them, the background part of your proposal or manuscript or the figures part of your manuscript, do you think that yun nga, babalik ako dun sa una kong point na if they would have questions on it, ano yung, like, would the literature review be able to cover them all? Kasi tama naman yung point mo na yung parang underlying implication ng question mo na you can only read so much, but at least you would have the minimum, at least kailangan lang na parang masasagot mo yung parang I think my advice would be you can try to look at these other parts of your manuscript or your proposal and you think to yourself, what would the questions that they would ask me, and then you go do the literature search to answer the questions that you ask yourself, and then syempre eventually you can, however much you prepare, magkakaroon ka pa rin ng gaps in your knowledge, and the teachers would like ask you about them. So the right way to answer actually is you can, based on the knowledge that you have, you can speculate. You can like say, I'm not sure about that part, but based on the current knowledge of these fields, you can, this is what I would speculate on. So yeah, because theoretically naman, if you actually know enough about a specific field, you would be able to speculate on the results, on the question, on the answer to the question that they have, right?
Thank you po.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, guys, do you have any more question for Chino? Okay, so if not, let's yeah,
I think my question is
from the messenger chat. So is it better to read one literature review first?
honestly, I think it depends on how your mind works.
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like, because the problem with reading other literature reviews first is minsan malilimit yung parang ma-shut off ka sa other for example theories na available out there because you think that the literature review is actually accurate. So my suggestion siguro would, but broadly tama yung read other literature reviews first. So siguro my suggestion would be to read several literature reviews on the subject. So if you're, for example, looking at steroids, you would want the effect of steroids on the brain. You would want to read several reviews, literature reviews, siguro mga dalawa, tatlo at least, to get a feel of kung ano ba yung competing theories on this, and to avoid your own bias, then your own implicit bias when you only read one paper that, yeah, when you only read one literature review.
Okay, thank you. So we have an thank you. So
Yeah,
we
I
have
hope that answers the question. I'm not sure.
I think so. And we also have another question. So, for example, you found a really good paper. So, should we thoroughly read every single paper we find? Oh, sorry. Yeah, every single paper we find. And is there a strategy to determine this? If that paper or those papers are you're going to read more deeply, or you're just gonna let this paper just
My
go?
first instinctive response here is, God, no. Sobrang daming papers. So yeah, don't thoroughly read every single paper, but track you would be able to determine kung importante ba siya dun sa topic mo or hindi. Uh, yeah, like, kasi parang eventually makikita mo na lang parang, especially the lower impact, the less famous journals, when you read them, parang you end up seeing na, ba't parang pare-pareho na lang yung sinasabi nilang lahat? And so when you start seeing in the abstract na parang, oh, this is the same, almost the same result from the other journal naman, from the other paper naman. So you can just end up not reading it so much. So parang, I think the deciding factor if you need to read a paper very well is um, how novel the result is. So by how novel, I mean parang, can you arrive at this result logically? And um, yeah, or can this method be something nakakaiba? So um, if yes, medyo hindi siya ganun ka important na paper. Kasi parang, yeah, the other paper predicts that result naman eh. So yeah, it's just for additional context, I would say. But for example, remember the CRISPR paper na, for example, if you look at the CRISPR topic, so during 2012, the recent Nobel Prize winners Dodna and Charpentier published a paper na sinasabi nila na this specific protein you can use for cutting gene sequences in bacteria, and then but we know and then 1 year later, another group naman from MIT, si Fang Jiang, sabi niya, pwede mo rin pala itong gawin sa eukaryotes. So, you can say na, yeah, logically siguro, parang if you're not very familiar with the field, logically para sabihin mo na, oo, kung kaya mong gawin sa prokaryotes, pwede mo rin naman siguro gawin sa eukaryotes. But if you actually already know the field, parang alam mo naman na napakalaki ng differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, di ba? So, sabihin nun, you can say na key paper yung ginawa ni this other person sa MIT. Right?
Yep, I agree on that. Okay, so we have one more question here. It's a good thing that we have a lot of questions, so we can clarify a lot of queries. So, have you
Yes,
experienced
I'm happy to
using,
answer.
yeah, have you
Mhm.
experienced using certain methods in reading research papers, like the calamari, like question, alternative, logic, method, results, inference? And are there any other ones like that?
First off, I like the name calamari. Gutom na ako. Anyway, so as for personal experience, hindi I have a specific method for myself. I didn't read this. Hindi ko siya binasa, hindi ko siya nabasa somewhere else. It's just that tinuro siya sa akin nung previous boss ko. Not hindi rin explicitly, parang over several conversations. And what I do is broadly similar to what I showed earlier. So actually, I read the abstract, and then so the abstract and the introduction. So that's a question, and then you go to the figures, and then when you go to the figures, you see the results, no, and you infer from these figures kung ano yung implications ng figures. And then while you're reading the figures, at least I don't know if kung notice nyo, I'm using the calamari terms. If you guys look at the messenger chat to contextualize my answer. And then while you read along the way, while you read the figures, you see the logic. Kasi yung logic part is essentially looking at the flow between figures eh. Kasi bakit ganito yung transition from figure 2 to figure 3? What's the logic behind that? And that's one of the questions that you end up asking kasi when you're reading the results. And then yung method, and then siguro yung method kasi I never thought of it kasi bilang I actually trained on these methods, but along the way din kasi when I'm reading the figures, I try to understand the method na rin. So actually, I kind of mashed together the logic method results inference part dun sa reading the figures. And then I try to draw my own conclusions from them. Tapos siya ako basahin yung summary to see if my own conclusions jive with what the authors are trying to say. And then, yeah. Tapos yung alternative part, siguro that's the part after you do the summary and discussion. Yeah, you think of, how do I improve this paper essentially? And yeah, dun sa part na are there any other ones like this? Definitely, yeah. Different professors have different ways of reading papers. If you Google like methods for reading papers, you would actually see a lot of them. Most of them are actually very useful, and it lets you understand yourself then, like how you think. Is it similar to how they think? And then if you think na similar yung method niyo of thinking, then you select that way. You select that method for yourself kasi it would jive well with how you operate. Oh, thank you. Hindi ko pa rin nakita to. Oh my God. What was it? This is good. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah,
Very
I think those are really good strategies. So
yeah.
do you have any more questions for China, guys, especially the mentees? Okay, so if none, thank you, Chino, for sharing your insights for this topic. And thank you for the mentees and the other mentors who are here. Um, don't worry, this video will be posted again in our Facebook page. And Chino, if you can share us the slides so we can compile it so that we can also
Sure.
give them to the mentees some time.
Okay.
Again, thank you everyone, and I hope you have a good night and go back to your dinner now.
Have a-
Okay.
Thank you guys.
Thank you,
Have a